Okay, stop. Before you scroll, I need you to hear this one thing. A man once blew up the actual city of Troy. On purpose. He literally took dynamite to what might be the most historically significant archaeological site on Earth just to find some gold he thought belonged to a king who may never have existed. And here's the wild part. He found treasure, thousands of gold objects, diadems, bracelets, rings, silver vases. He dressed his wife in it, photographed her, and smuggled the whole lot out of the country. And then it turned out he was digging in completely the wrong layer. The gold was real, the site was real, but the treasure he found was over 1,000 years older than the Trojan War he was looking for. The man had destroyed the very history he was trying to find. So now I have to ask you, what is the Trojan War, really? Is it myth? Is it history? Is it both? Because here's what I can tell you right now. The answer to that question has been argued about by historians, archaeologists, and classicists for over 150 years. And nobody told you the most interesting parts. By the end of this video, you're going to know something that most people, including a lot of historians, still argue about at conferences with bad wine and strong opinions. And honestly, the real answer is way more interesting than the movie. Let's go. Alright, so first, we need to set the scene. Because if you don't understand the world the Trojan War happened in, none of it makes sense. We're talking about roughly 1200 BC, give or take a few decades. This is the late Bronze Age, and honestly, the Bronze Age Mediterranean was kind of like the ancient world's version of the Cold War era, except instead of superpowers with nukes, you had superpowers with chariots, bronze swords, and really elaborate trade routes. Multiple civilizations, all deeply interconnected, all watching each other very carefully. A world that had been humming along for centuries, and was about to fall apart in ways nobody saw coming. You've got the Mycenaean Greeks on one side, and these are not the toga-wearing, philosophy-spouting Greeks you picture from the movies. These were war-obsessed, palace-building, raiding culture warriors. Think more Viking than Socrates, honestly. They had bronze plate armor, boar tusk helmets, and war chariots. They raided each other's coastlines. They kept meticulous palace records of grain and livestock and military equipment written in a script called Linear B. These were hard, practical people with a very clear value system: glory, honor, loot, and legacy. On the other side of the Aegean Sea, the body of water sitting between modern Greece and modern Turkey, you've got the city of Troy. And Troy was no joke. The city archaeologists now connect to the Trojan War sat at Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, overlooking the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. That location? Priceless, literally. Whoever controlled the Dardanelles controlled trade between two worlds. Ships carrying grain, metals, timber, horses, everything had to pass through that narrow channel. And Troy sat right on top of it like a toll booth on a superhighway. Now here's where things get really fascinating. Archaeologists haven't just found one Troy, they've found 9. 9 separate cities, built one on top of another, layer by layer, over roughly 4,000 years of continuous human settlement, designated Troy 1 through Troy 9. And when researchers started mapping these layers, they found something extraordinary. The layer most likely connected to Homer's Trojan War is called Troy 7A, destroyed around 1190 to 1180 BC. In that destruction layer, burned debris, scattered human bones, signs that the population had been under severe stress, rooms subdivided, storage jars sunk into floors, signs of people crowding in, maybe fleeing something outside the walls. Is that the Trojan War? We can't say for certain, but it fits, and that's more than most legends can say. Quick pause. I'm genuinely curious about something. Before watching this video, did you think the Trojan War was real, fake, or somewhere in between? Drop it in the comments right now. Real, fake, or maybe, and let's see where everyone lands. I'll be reading every single one. And I promise, by the end of this video, your answer might change. Some of yours definitely will. Okay, back to it. Okay, so, Paris. Paris of Troy is, and I say this with genuine historical affection, one of the most chaotic figures in ancient mythology. He's a prince, son of King Priam of Troy, one of the most powerful men in the ancient world. Good-looking guy, decent with a bow, not particularly known for his battlefield valor. And he ends up right in the middle of the one beef between three Greek goddesses that absolutely no one should have gotten involved in. No one. Not a mortal, not a demigod, no one. He did not get that memo. Here's what happened. There's a divine wedding, and a goddess named Eris, the goddess of discord, naturally, crashes the party and throws down a golden apple inscribed with the words, "For the fairest." Three goddesses immediately claim it: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. And Zeus, king of the gods, all-powerful cosmic ruler, takes one look at this situation and goes, "Nope, not my problem." He hands the judgment to Paris, essentially saying, "You deal with it." This is called the Judgment of Paris, and each goddess bribes him. Hera offers power and kingdoms. Athena offers wisdom and military skill. Aphrodite? Aphrodite offers him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris picks Aphrodite. Of course he does. And the most beautiful woman in the world, according to the Greeks, was Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. Now, whether Paris abducted Helen or whether she went willingly is a debate that ancient authors argued about for centuries. Some accounts say she was taken by force. Others, including some ancient Greek writers, suggest she left on her own terms. The truth? Lost to time. But the result was the same either way. Helen of Troy, or Helen of Sparta, if you want to be technically accurate, was gone. And her husband Menelaus was not happy, which is, I think, a fairly reasonable response. Menelaus calls in a favor, a big one. See, back when Helen's father was choosing who she'd marry, basically every eligible king and hero in Greece showed up to compete. And her father, being a smart man, made them all swear an oath, the oath of Tyndareus, that whoever she married, every other suitor would come to that husband's defense if anyone ever tried to take her. So when Paris takes Helen, Menelaus turns to his brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, arguably the most powerful king in the Greek world, and says, "I need that fleet." And Agamemnon, who probably saw this as a great opportunity to expand Mycenaean influence eastward, starts making calls. What assembles is the most extraordinary military coalition in the ancient world. Here's something the movies gloss over. The Trojan War lasted 10 years. 10 years. Most people think of it as this grand Hollywood battle where everything gets decided in a few dramatic scenes. But nope. This was a decade of grinding, brutal, often inconclusive warfare fought outside the walls of a heavily fortified city. And that's actually really realistic for Bronze Age warfare. Bronze weapons were expensive. Bronze, as an alloy of copper and tin, required long-distance trade routes for its raw materials. You couldn't manufacture weapons en masse. Pitched battles were dangerous and costly. So Bronze Age warfare was largely about raiding, sieges, and economic attrition, punctuated by moments of genuine, terrifying violence. Now here's something that surprises most people. Homer's Iliad, the epic poem that gave us basically everything we know about the Trojan War, doesn't cover the whole war. It covers roughly 51 days of the 10th year, just the final stretch. And at its center is not the war itself. It's a quarrel within the Greek camp. Agamemnon, the Greek commander-in-chief, seizes a captive woman named Briseis from Achilles as a show of authority. And Achilles, the greatest warrior Greece has, the one man who could probably end the whole war in a week, is so furious that he withdraws from the war entirely. He just goes back to his tent and refuses to fight. To modern ears, Achilles sounds like he's throwing a tantrum. And look, I get that. But in Bronze Age warrior culture, honor wasn't just ego. Honor was survival. Your reputation determined whether men would follow you into battle, whether your enemies would fear you before you even raised a sword, whether you'd live or die when the odds were against you. Agamemnon had publicly stripped Achilles of his prize, his war trophy, his valor token, in front of the entire Greek army. That wasn't an insult, that was an existential wound. So Achilles sits down, and the Greeks start losing, badly. Achilles has a best friend. His name is Patroclus, and the bond between them, however you interpret it, romantic, brotherly, whatever, is the emotional core of the entire Iliad. These are two men who genuinely love each other in the deepest sense of that word. Patroclus watches the Greeks getting massacred. He watches men he knows dying on the beach. He can't take it anymore. He goes to Achilles and begs to go fight wearing Achilles' armor. Basically, to pretend to be Achilles, to terrify the Trojans into retreating. Achilles agrees, with one instruction: don't push too far forward. Patroclus doesn't listen. He charges deep into the Trojan lines, pushing all the way to the city walls, and he's killed by Hector, Troy's greatest warrior, Paris's older brother. When Achilles finds out Patroclus is dead, something breaks. Not his spirit, something much more dangerous. His fear, his self-preservation, his last reason to hold back. This, not Agamemnon's insult, not 10 years of war, not Helen. This is what breaks Achilles open. The grief, the rage, the devastation of losing someone he loved above everything. And in his grief, Achilles does what the entire Greek army couldn't do in a decade. He storms back onto the battlefield and hunts down Hector, the man who killed his best friend, with the singular, terrifying purpose of a man who no longer cares whether he lives or dies. He kills Hector, chases him 3 times around the walls of Troy in front of every Trojan watching from the battlements, then kills him, then drags the body behind his chariot around the walls of the city. It's brutal, it's savage, and Homer doesn't try to make it heroic. Achilles is consumed by grief in a way that has crossed into something frightening. But then, and this is where Homer does something extraordinary, King Priam of Troy, Hector's father, an old man, walks into the Greek camp, alone, at night, through enemy territory, with only a herald and a cart full of ransom gifts. He kneels before the man who killed his son, and he begs. He asks Achilles to remember his own father, an old man waiting at home for a son who may never return. And Achilles gives Hector's body back. That scene. That is why the Iliad has lasted 3,000 years. Then Achilles is killed, shot by an arrow, in the heel, guided, according to the myth, by the god Apollo, directing the aim of Paris, of all people, the man whose entire catastrophic life choices started this whole war. Now, the story about his mother dipping him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable, leaving only his heel unprotected, that's actually a later addition to the myth. Homer doesn't include it in the Iliad, it appears in later texts. But the phrase it gave us, Achilles' heel, meaning your one critical vulnerability, is still in our language today, 3,000 years later. That's the power of a good story. Now, here's the thing about the Trojan horse. The thing everyone associates with this entire story. It's not in the Iliad. It's referenced obliquely in the Odyssey and described in detail in later texts. But the essential story is this. Odysseus, the craftiest of the Greeks, devises a plan. Build an enormous wooden horse, hide soldiers inside it, leave it as a fake offering to the goddess Athena with an inscription saying the Greeks have gone home. Then the Greeks fake a retreat, sail away over the horizon, pretend the war is over. A Greek spy named Sinon stays behind and convinces the Trojans the horse is a sacred offering. Against the warnings of the prophetess Cassandra, who literally has the power of prophecy but is cursed to never be believed, which is the ancient world's most exhausting life situation, the Trojans drag the horse inside the city walls. They celebrate. They think they've won. That night, the soldiers climb out. Open the city gates, and the Greeks who had sailed back under cover of darkness flood in. Troy burns. The war that started with a stolen woman, or a woman who left, we'll never know. Fueled by geopolitics, sustained by pride, and decided by trickery, ends in fire. King Priam is killed at the altar of Zeus. Cassandra is taken captive. The city that stood for thousands of years is razed. And the Greeks, triumphant, exhausted, sail home, though most of them won't make it easily. Odysseus takes 10 more years just to get back to Ithaca. But that's a different story. Okay, so, was the Trojan horse real? Like, actually real? Probably not in the literal sense of a giant wooden horse full of soldiers. Probably. But here's what's interesting. The Mykonos vase, dating to around 675 BC, depicts a horse with soldiers clearly visible inside it, suggesting the story was circulating within roughly 500 years of the supposed events. Other historians have proposed that the wooden horse was metaphorical, perhaps a battering ram covered in horsehide, which Assyrian armies actually used as siege equipment. That's a real thing. And one more theory? The horse may have been a ship. Ancient Greek ships were sometimes called horses. Wooden horse might have been slang for a warship that sailed back in under cover of darkness. We genuinely don't know. And that ambiguity is sort of perfect, because it means the story has stayed alive, debated, argued, retold for 3 millennia. All right, back to our boy Schliemann. Heinrich Schliemann began excavating Hisarlik in 1870. He was a German businessman, not a trained archaeologist. A self-made millionaire who taught himself ancient Greek because he was obsessed with Homer from childhood. He genuinely, truly, deeply believed the Iliad was a literal history book. Like, not metaphorically. He thought Homer was basically a journalist who had slightly exaggerated things. It's worth noting, he was actually pointed to Hisarlik by a British archaeologist named Frank Calvert, who owned part of the land and had already identified the site as a likely candidate. Schliemann had the money, took over the dig, and took most of the credit, which, historically, is a whole other drama. But Schliemann? Schliemann had dynamite and a deadline. In 1873, Schliemann found treasure. Stunning treasure. Thousands of gold artifacts, diadems, bracelets, rings, necklaces, silver vases. He called it Priam's treasure. He dressed his wife Sophia in the gold jewelry, photographed her, announced his discovery to the world, and smuggled the artifacts out of Turkey, which, by the way, was completely illegal. There was just one problem. He was digging in Troy too. A layer dating to approximately 2400 BC. The Trojan War, if it happened, was around 1200 BC. He had found treasure that was 1,200 years too old. And he'd literally demolished the layers he needed, including parts of what we now know as Troy 6 and Troy 7a, trying to get to them. It's genuinely heartbreaking from an archaeological standpoint, and also, honestly, kind of hilarious. Modern archaeologists, working with far more care and far less dynamite, have spent decades piecing together what Schliemann damaged. And what they've found in the correctly identified layers is remarkable. Troy 6 was a large, prosperous city built around 1750 BC, with massive stone walls and a sophisticated urban layout. It was clearly a major regional power. It was destroyed around 1300 BC, and the evidence points to a major earthquake. On top of those ruins, Troy 7a was built. Smaller, more cramped, The subdivided rooms and storage jars sunk into the floors suggest a population under stress, possibly a city preparing for siege. And Troy 7a was violently destroyed around 1180 to 1190 BC. Fire, scattered bones, signs of conflict. Is that the Trojan War? The archaeology says with confidence, something violent happened at that site, at roughly the right time, matching the time frame preserved in Homer's oral tradition. That's not proof, but it's not nothing. And here's what I think is the most extraordinary piece of evidence in this entire story. Hittite records from the major Bronze Age empire in central Turkey refer to a city called Wilusa in documents spanning the 13th and 14th centuries BC. Most scholars now believe Wilusa equals Troy, and those records describe real political disputes between the Hittites and a people called Ahiyawa, which most scholars believe corresponds to the Mycenaean Greeks, the Achaeans of Homer. So in Hittite diplomatic records, actual government documents, bureaucratic correspondence, not mythology, there are references to disputes over a city that is probably Troy, involving people who are probably Greeks. That is extraordinary. That is the mundane, bureaucratic fingerprint of a real conflict preserved in clay. Now, here's the part that blows my mind the most, and I think this is genuinely the most underrated aspect of how the Trojan War story gets told. The Trojan War, if it happened around 1184 BC, as the ancient mathematician Eratosthenes calculated, occurred right at the edge of one of the most catastrophic events in all of ancient history, the Late Bronze Age collapse. Between roughly 1200 and 1150 BC, almost every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously collapsed. The Mycenaean Greek palace culture, gone. The Hittite Empire, gone. The Egyptian New Kingdom, severely crippled. Major trading cities across Cyprus, the Levant, modern Syria, burned, abandoned, never rebuilt. It was a cascade failure of interconnected civilizations so complete that some historians have called it the first systems collapse in recorded history. And here's the truly sobering part of this whole story. After Troy fell, if it fell, the Mycenaean Greeks went home, victorious. They had done it. 10 years of war, and they had brought down the greatest city in the ancient world. And within a generation or two, their own civilization had collapsed too. The great palaces of Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, burned or abandoned. The linear B writing system, the only form of literacy the Mycenaean Greeks had, forgotten, completely, as if it had never existed. Greece entered what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, a period of roughly 400 years where literacy, long-distance trade, and urban life essentially evaporated. The world that fought the Trojan War destroyed itself in the fighting, or perhaps, more accurately, the forces that destroyed Troy also destroyed the people who destroyed it. Think about that. And here is maybe the most miraculous part of this entire story. For roughly 400 years after the collapse, the Greek Dark Ages, there was no writing, no formal records, no archives, nothing. But memory survived. Through oral poetry, bards called auoidoi, who memorized and performed epic poems at festivals and chieftains' banquets, the memory of the Bronze Age world was passed down, generation after generation, preserved in the rhythmic, memorable patterns of ancient verse. You'd sit around a fire after dinner, and the bard would sing about Achilles and Hector and Helen and the burning city, the world your great-great-great-grandparents had lived in, that no one had written down, that only survived because someone kept singing it. And sometime around 750 to 700 BC, roughly 500 years after the events of the Trojan War, a poet we call Homer gathered those oral traditions and composed the Iliad and the Odyssey. Whether Homer was one person, a blind poet from the island of Chios or Smyrna, as ancient tradition holds, or a collective tradition of bards whose work was eventually compiled, scholars still argue about that. But here's the remarkable thing. The catalog of ships in the Iliad lists cities, like Pylos, that were already abandoned ruins by Homer's time in the 8th century BC, which means Homer wasn't making them up. He couldn't have been. He was preserving names from an oral tradition that stretched back 500 years. That's the equivalent of someone today accurately describing medieval English towns that no longer exist, from memory, in verse, without any written records, without Google. He wasn't inventing a fantasy. He was a vessel for 500 years of preserved memory. And modern oral tradition scholarship, pioneered by Milman Parry and Albert Lord in the 20th century, proved something extraordinary. The Iliad's structure, its repeated phrases, its formulaic epithets, swift-footed Achilles, gray-eyed Athena, rosy-fingered Dawn, is exactly consistent with how oral poetry is transmitted across centuries without writing. These aren't lazy repetitions, they're memory anchors, structural tools that allowed bards to hold thousands of lines of poetry in their heads across decades of performance. The poems aren't just literature, they are a delivery mechanism for preserved Bronze Age memory. Bronze weapons in a world that had switched to iron, diplomatic structures matching the Hittite records, palace cultures that had been dust for 400 years. Homer wasn't inventing a fantasy, he was preserving, imperfectly, mythologically, magnificently, real echoes of a world that had burned. So, was the Trojan War real? Here's my honest answer, and I think it's the most satisfying one available. Yes, and also no, and that's exactly the point. There was almost certainly a real city at Hisarlik. It was prosperous, strategic, powerful, and it sat on the most important waterway in the ancient world. It was almost certainly the city the Hittites called Wilusa, disputed between Hittite and Mycenaean powers in real diplomatic documents. Troy 7a was destroyed around 1180 BC in what looks, archaeologically, like violent conflict. The late Bronze Age world of warrior kings, long sea voyages, and city-sacking coalitions, all of it, was completely real. The specific story of Helen, Paris, Achilles, the wooden horse, these are mythological elaborations, divine interventions, prophetic curses, a hero made invulnerable by river water. These are the fingerprints of oral tradition transforming real events into legend over centuries of retelling. Every generation that sang those songs added something, smoothed something out, made the heroes larger, made the gods more present, made the tragedy more perfect. Because that's what memory does. It doesn't preserve reality, it preserves meaning. But underneath the myth is memory, and underneath the memory is history, and underneath the history is a catastrophe so complete that it almost erased itself from the face of the earth, only to survive in the voice of a poet, the obsession of a reckless businessman with dynamite, and the careful brushwork of modern scientists in a Turkish field. And here's the thing that gets me every time I think about it. The Trojan War didn't just happen, it echoed forward. It shaped Greek identity for centuries. The Greeks built their entire sense of heroism and tragedy on the foundation of this one war. It gave Western literature its first great masterpiece. It gave the Romans the myth of Aeneas, a Trojan prince who supposedly fled the burning city and eventually founded Rome, giving the Roman Empire its mythological origin story. It gave us the phrase Achilles' heel, still used in medical journals, sports commentary, and business strategy today. It gave us the phrase Trojan horse, which today describes a category of cyber attacks on computer networks. 3,000 years later, we are still inside this story. Its language is in our language. Its archetypes are in our films, our novels, our video games. And maybe that's the real miracle. Not that Troy fell, but that we remember it, 3,000 years later. One obsessive German businessman with dynamite and a childhood dream. One poet, blind or not, real or composite, preserving the memory of a lost world across 500 years of darkness. 9 cities stacked on top of each other in a muddy mound in Turkey. Layers of ash, gold, and bone. A war that may have really happened, inside a story that definitely did. History isn't always clean. It doesn't always arrive in neat, verifiable packages with citations and timestamps. Sometimes it arrives buried under myth, under sand, under someone else's terrible excavation decisions. But it arrives. It always arrives. If you made it this far, genuinely, thank you. This is the kind of history I absolutely live for. Go back to that comment you dropped earlier. Real, fake, or maybe. And tell me if your answer changed. I'm betting for a lot of you it did. Because I was in your position once, and then I fell down this rabbit hole and I haven't fully climbed out since. And if tonight's existential crisis isn't quite complete yet, if you want to understand why the entire Bronze Age world collapsed all at once, why civilizations that had stood for centuries vanished within a single generation, and what that tells us about our own interconnected world today, I've got a video on the late Bronze Age collapse that will absolutely finish the job. Link is right up there. I'll see you in the next one.